So here is the question. What if America never unified? Right. I'm gonna be drawing basically what was the roughly the borders of. I'm gonna be keeping the map like this. I'm not gonna be changing the Canadian states, but I'm gonna be doing roughly what was the borders basically of all of the colonies. Vermont was already an independent country by the time, but what if they still won the Revolutionary Wars, but all the states of America never unified and all said, let's go our separate ways, and blah 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 blah. There are already a couple of these types of videos online, made by several YouTubers, but yep, this is what the world basically looked like. And Canada didn't exist yet either. Canada was mostly here. And most of this was free and open land. So, and Russia was in Alaska. So, yep, this is where we start. So, eventually, this is 1800 now, and I won't be surprised there are a couple wars between these guys. All of these guys are basically separate countries. So, some countries would eventually, some countries would eventually become monarchies or dictatorships. Which again, America fought against monarchies and dictatorships, but here we are. They're elected dictatorships. I think the most likely places to develop dictatorships are in the South. The South is the most likely place to elect a dictatorship-like government. Certain states will start to expand. I'm gonna put this here because that's just all can. Britain will be worried about these other states expanding. Georgia would expand up to here and also Spain on all here, all border basically at the time. So states like Georgia and South Carolina would essentially just start expanding, basically taking over land after of course the states got themselves together. These states would start gaining more and more power. West Virginia does not exist in this timeline, as it basically never really existed, as Virginia would never let West Virginia become its own country. Mexico would gain its independence around 1820 as the states continued to expand. New York and Pennsylvania expand so pesky Britain did not steal their territory away. And the southern states would start expanding. But eventually these state colonies would start to revolt on their own and form their own countries. Not yet though, but they would. The first one is the Westfolded Republic, which, unlike in our time, successfully establishes itself currently as its own country. Same thing with Tennessee. Tennessee didn't want to be associated with South Carolina. Same thing with this part of Virginia. Because they are so isolated from the rest of Virginia, they basically form their own West Virginia in Kentucky. They basically call themselves, this is basically just this version of Kentucky. They just did not want to be a part of Virginia, and they fought a couple-year-long war against them. These new countries would basically significantly add to the GDP of the world. The most powerful state currently is, of course, New York. They are flexing those huge New York muscles, and would basically conquer the weaker, smaller neighbors to proclaim the New York Empire. Meanwhile, Britain would just colonize the rest of Canada, because they have nothing better to do. So, basically, almost all Canada, they will basically just continue expanding. Meanwhile, Mexico is, of course, suffering with their own problems, and Texas says we want to be our own country. Because the U.S. states are diving it, basically says, F you, Mexico, Texas will become its own country. And This is the borders established. By the time Texas established its own country, Georgia establishes the Georgian Empire, but Louisiana becomes independent from France and starts its own empire called the Louisiana Empire, which also has their own king. The Georgian Empire would basically there, but but the short-lived country of Kentucky would be eventually been conquered by Virginia, basically enlarging Virginia's size. Tennessee would be hard to conquer because of the mountains. Tennessee was able to be expanding as well. Well, Britain to make sure to dictate to and Ohio would and settlers from Pennsylvania would basically have said F you and would form our own country in Ohio. And Ohio would basically become its own country. We basically said F you to Pennsylvania and doing their own thing. So this is the political map of North America. Central America is still unified, and a lot of these places have not gained their independence. Puerto Rico would eventually fight a war for independence. There's no America to take them away from Spain, so they'll eventually just fight the war for independence against Spain, and Spain would likely lose. This would be the modern day. This would be the borders in 1840. The Kentucky Republic has been founded, which was basically mostly people from Virginia, and they fought a couple wars in Virginia, but they lost because of the insane mountainous terrain. The Virginians do not know how to navigate the mountainous terrain. A new settlement called Chicago was also settled. They basically became the hub of the Great Lakes and formed a new Venice-like empire. Yeah. Next is Oregon would be colonized by Canada. Because there's no America, Oregon is now a part of Canada and remains distinctly Canadian. Alaska basically remains Russian and does not gain and will likely gain independence later, or stays an integral state. Mexico establishes a border with Britain. Basically, they just didn't want to have they want to make so all of California and New Mexico, Nevada are a part. Actually, no, all New Mexico are a part of California, and they can establish a border. The Great Republic of the Chicago, which again is basically just Venice and North, is basically like the Republic of Venice in North America, starts to expand in most of the coastal areas. But a great rival appears, and that is Detroit, wanting to copy essentially the same thing, and basically not wanting to become a part of Canada. They form their own republic, and the rest of Michigan forms a small kingdom called the Kingdom of Michigania, and they form their own country, basically acting as a buffer state. Ohio and a new country of Indiana was also formed as well, and they essentially has expanded to Michigan, causing these extremely strange and odd borders here. The new country of Indiana starts to expand into southern Illinois, becoming a new republic. But most of these countries have adopted either a republic area, a republic, or a kingdom. Mostly kingdoms, which mostly dominate the South. The Kingdom of Arkansas is also founded as well, and basically stays its own country. The South will not abolish slavery until far later. Because the South is their own country, there will be no civil war. But there would be a civil war in New York, as New Jersey and Connecticut are fed up with it. Also, New England starts to unify. They enter a personal union and they form the New England Republic. The other two are reluctant to join. Connecticut gains their independence beyond New Jersey cannot, and thus the New England Republic was formed. New England becomes a powerhouse in the world stage, and basically becomes its own country. California starts its own rebellion and forms the California Republic, copying exactly what Texas did. California also claims all of this desert, but the Mormons said no and they formed their own country. Deseret was also founded and also rebelled against Mexico. Mexico basically said, fine, we'll give up, and all land north of Arizona, basically just giving California and Utah the free land. A new group of settlers start appearing as well. Texas starts the war against Mexico, starts several wars against Mexico, and they gain this land, and they also annex all of here. Forming Texas will soon become a regional superpower in the region, as they beat Mexico several times despite having more people, which always means that population is not the only thing in the world that matters. Georgia cannot hold Alabama and Mississippi rebel, basically forming one country. Florida essentially does Spain just eventually just grants Florida independence, then will eventually grant Florida independence. But we don't have to worry about Florida and Empire later. A new country a new republic is formed. The Dakota formed their own republic, and basically they live in all of here. They start expanding because there's really no one here. Because there's nowhere to expand to, this is their entire republic. They are likely gonna expand in the future. Meanwhile, parts of Wisconsin form their own republic called Wisconsin. Yeah. And basically they eventually form their own country and start expanding east, as basically no one lived here. This part of the area becomes their own country, and Michigan becomes the border gore of the world. This basically becomes Michigan, and they just basically become a buffer state. They unify with the other part of Michigan as well. Well, despite Chicago's small size, they are basically a regional superpower as well. Well, yes, they do have a rival, which is Detroit, but basically Chicago basically becomes the Venice of the Great Lakes in North America. Wisconsin and Britain eventually established a border. Britain starts colonizing more parts of North America. Seeing no one wants these areas, Idaho and Montana are now officially Canadian. And that will probably send a chill down every American's spine, including myself, but this is alternate history. This is if, of course, America never unified. And the borders would basically be pretty similar, because Britain just likes drawing straight lines for borders, so there's really nothing you can do about that. So now the year is 1900 and most of North America looks like this. And also Mexico is becoming much and much weaker. Californian and Texan influence has basically reduced Mexico to dust here. And they also lost another war against Texas and California in the late 1800s. Texas basically becoming a new regional superpower, taking parts of New Mexico as well. Here, nobody really lives here yet. But the Mormons also expand as well, basically expanding Mormonism to everybody else, so people can be forced to become Mormons. That's essentially it. But the Kingdom of Deseret expands. They become a regional powerhouse in the region, at least resisting Texas and Californian influence for now. Now, Texan influence continues to influence here. A new state was formed. A new country was formed, basically Oklahoma. Texas basically founds them as a new puppet. World War I comes around, and this is the map of North America. The Great Plains Republic becomes a country, and basically becomes a constitutional republic. Brick. The Lakota have not really wanted to expand. Basically, they just want to have their historical lands back. They want to have the lands and basically can have a Native American republic. Rick. Also, this country is another vassal of Texas, which is basically just Colorado. And the rest of this is all Canadian land. So, Britain owns all of this. And basically, this is just no man's land. Canada basically took all of this. So, and the Lakota finally said, okay, we'll expand. We'll take this last bit of area, and most of the North America is owned by at least somebody. The World War I starts. But before World War I starts, Maryland and Delaware have a war, and Delaware was promptly defeated by Maryland, basically giving Maryland more land. Virginia, angry at Kentucky's entire existence, declares another war, but they lose to Kentucky again, and Kentucky's modern-day borders are basically done. Most of North America have pretty positive relations with each other. No real major wars have happened. And outside of California, taking the rest of Nevada, which is basically an uninhabitable desert anyways, and Florida finally gained their independence, and the Cowboy Republic has been founded in Arizona and New Mexico. The Cowboy Nation has been founded. We can firstly say that North America has basically been like this. West Florida, before World War I, West Florida and Florida united into one country. Basically being the same culture, they basically said, you know what, why are we different countries? We have one culture, we should become one country. Both Floridas agree. But the South Carolinas, they have been historical rivals. They have been fighting for decades, but no peace deals have been found. They both have very similar populations, and both are basically enemies. Also, Florida, Georgia wins a war, Tennessee fights a war and wins this triangle they have been disputing against Alabama this whole time. Another thing that happens is the Toledo dispute, which Ohio lost Detroit, as Detroit has much more industry than Ohio. Some of these places are basically third world countries, like the Great Plains Republic. The Great Plains Republic has lost war after war after war to Britain and the Lakota. The Lakota gets some land from the Great Plains Republic. Even though Lakota is also around that place, they're definitely much more developed than the weak Great Plains Republic. The weak Great Plains Republic has no people anyways, and Lakota have more people because they were not killed off. But Texas's vassal states, yeah, they're still vassal states. The state Republic, basically Kansas has been formed by both of Texas's vassals, and basically got a war for independence. They win, and they're still out, but they're still gonna be good allies. World War I starts, and several countries join the Central Powers, which they make the big mistake. North Carolina and South Carolina are two exact countries. South Carolina joins the Allies, and North Carolina joins the Central Powers. Most of the New England area joins the Allied powers except for New York. New York wanted revenge on, of course, New England and Pennsylvania for humiliating in the last war, and of course Delaware wanted their independence, causes the big war of New England. Texas wanted to show the dominance over the world, over Louisiana, starts the war of Louisiana again, but peace was done between both of them, and really nothing happens over here. This is basically the South America of America. Nothing ever happens here. The real war is and after World War I, the Allies of course win, and this area has been taken from North Carolina. North Carolina is extremely furious about this. And New York is humiliated once again. New Jersey is independent, and of course Niagara is independent. New York is extremely humiliated by this. Losing land to all of its neighbors, essentially. New York wants their revenge, just like Germany, and a certain man with skinny mustache. And basically, New York becomes one of Skinny Mustache Man's greatest allies, We can't say its name because now it's basically World War II. And New York says, we want to basically rule. North Carolina and New York are basically very angry at the rest of America. The rest of America have pretty positive relations, and the Great Plains Republic continues being destroyed, and the southern part rebellion become Iowa. Well, being sick of the Great Plains Republic, it basically falls into anarchy, and nobody wants to go there. So there's basically no government there. So basically, it's the least developed country in the world. There was basically an ongoing civil war there, and we'll find out who wins later. New York basically occupies all of here, and North Carolina takes over most of South Carolina with a certain mustache man's help. But of course, we all know he loses the war. But also, Alabama becomes communist during World War II, and basically allies itself with the Soviet Union, which also joins the Allies, so Alabama and Tennessee both become communist and both help South Carolina in the battle against North Carolina, which basically means they push them back. But instead, North Carolina is now spread to South Carolina, East Carolina, and South Carolina. Basically expanding the communist, and this is basically the communist states and the non-communist states. New York is partitioned. Basically, like most of the other, basically is partitioned between New Jersey, New England, and Pennsylvania. So this is the world map right now. Now, we're not going to be starting to factor in alliances. And also because there was no USA, there was no Manhattan Project. California barely beat Japan, with the help, of course, Great Britain, who instead developed a nuclear weapon, because somebody had to. And of course, it was Britain. And all countries signed up to never use nuclear weapons again, because they're too dangerous. Basically, now we have the new world. These are blue means communist reading, and blue means capitalist, and red means communist. This states. Louisiana, the rebellion in the Great Plains states causes the states to become a communist land, and they take over the rebellion Iowa. Iowa basically loses as well, and concerned about the communist states nearby, Chicago and Wisconsin join it as well. Also, Canada joins as well, and Alaska is still a part of the Soviet Union. They'll become independent eventually after the end of the Cold War, just not now. And also, Canada joins, of course, the capitalist world because Canada is an independent country. Unlike the USA, Britain just says, you know what, Canada, you can be your own place. No one lives here, so come on, Canada, just be your own place. And Canada basically says, okay, I accept. And Canada basically remains Canada. Canada is not the world's superpower. And also, New York is finally given its independence. New York still basically to prevent further wars and after done fighting again in Canada. And of course, Denmark and Iceland, which are also allies. Actually, I'm starting to acknowledge this is a purple color, but who cares? New York is no longer partitioned and made a capitalist ally. The Soviet Union, infuriated by this basically starts a revolt. Well, Florida, of course. And Florida, of course, loses. This causes Florida to become divided into a north and south. The North Florida is basically where Disney World will be and all the good stuff. South Florida will basically become like Cuba. And Cuba, of course, helps with the invasion because they still lost to communist forces. Fidel Castro still took over. So, basically, South Florida is now a communist country. Some countries were made to stay neutral, for example, Arkansas, Indiana, Ohio, and Detroit. Detroit also goes in the fall. Detroit refusing to join Arkansas basically elects a communist government, and yeah, they become on the communist side. Basically, it's the 90s, and basically nothing really happens except for Texas making the new Texas Pact, which basically includes that's Louisiana and Kansas. Basically they want to make a neutral pact and a alliance. Several Caribbean countries also join as well because they also want to be neutral. Many nations, this is basically the non-aligned pact. These guys don't want to be a part of any alliance. Oh, I forgot to give. I actually forgot to give Maine to New England. That is one mistake I'm sure people go point out this video becomes popular. We're going to fix it right now. But basically, this is what the world looks like. And this is the world in 1990. This is basically the world. And yeah, it is pretty much a mess. The rest of the countries want to become their own independent countries. They want to remain neutral nations, including the Lakota and many others. And yeah. But in this world, because there isn't really any problems. But again, because there was no real superpower nations, the Soviet Union still clings on, but they lose Alaska anyways. And Alaska becomes independent. Then, so much for that. And same thing with other failed states. And basically the Soviet Union collapses. Texas does not really need the pact anymore, and North Carolina reunifies. But Florida fails to reunify and becomes North and South Korea. Yeah. Because of Cuban aid. And Texas not needing this pact anymore, but Texas becoming one. But now there is a new competition. Texas wants to become a world superpower. Texas has the second one of the largest economies in the world. It has, unlike the modern day Texas, this Texas has around 48 million people. So this Texas has more people than modern day California, and California is a powerhouse. That's because Texas has been trying to become a great regional superpower. And basically Arkansas and Kentucky, and all the former communist states, become under Texan influence. So this is the world now. And Guatemala and Colombia become under Texan influence. And communist influence is basically null and void. Around 2010, South Florida basically falls because of government corruption, and Florida reunifies. Basically because there was a massive revolt there. So basically Florida is the last place they reunify. And there has been a growing urge for independence in certain areas. New Jersey, also around 2011, Delaware finally gained back its independence after a vote, with 89% of Delawareans voting for independence. And basically becoming a new republic. And then in 2017, Texas and Mexico formally signed an agreement to become allies. So basically, with the biggest countries in North America on their side, Texas has become a rival to the other countries. Despite both being capitalist, Texas basically has their own space program and everything. Even founding their own space program named NASA, which is basically now a Texan space program. And basically using the help of all the countries, they get to the moon and stuff as well, which they also already landed on the moon in 1969. Well, at the same time as America, but they went on the moon many more times. And now there's a huge second space race between Canada and Texas, which is pretty odd to say, with Florida, of course, helping, but it's Florida. What do you expect? So now the modern day world. So basically the biggest regional powers in America is Texas and, of course, Canada. Because Canada basically owns places like Oregon and Seattle, Canada can have a lot more power. And also, there is a divide between North and South. With the exception of the rich, there is a divide, but now it's between the North and South. With the exception of the very rich Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, most of the richer countries in Americas are basically in the North. And the South, most of the South is influenced by Texan culture, which most of the Southern Dixie culture is basically very similar to Texas's main culture. And most of the Southern culture is inspired by Texan culture, including country music and cowboys and everything. But some countries do elect to be neutral. For example, for certain states. For example, the Cowboy Republic, the Cowboy Nation, and of course, Kansas have stayed under Texan influence forever alongside Louisiana and most of Central America. And the only real communist influence left in 2019 is, of course, Cuba. 2020, COVID-19. COVID-19 became a worldwide pandemic. The worst affected countries in North America include Canada, Florida, and Texas, and of course Mexico. These four countries having the largest populations. Canada having around 115 million people, Florida having around 30 million people, Texas having around 60 million people, and of course Mexico having the same population as it has now. But what about California? California hasn't really developed that much, only having 15 million people. New York also only has 16 million people as well. That's because large chunks of New York were taken during wars in the past, with Pennsylvania being around 14 million people and Chicago being around 12 million. And I'll put down the populations of each area now. Canada, having the most people, has 115 million people. Most of the population is concentrated here and here. Second most populated, the most populated area is Mexico, 120 million. Most of these areas have roughly the same population as they do now, as they basically stay the same. So Mexico still has 140 million people, and Cuba, for example, still has 10 million people. And both of these places have 11 million people. So all of here stays the same. Alaska has more people because of Russia. Russia basically says, let's settle Alaska. And Alaska has 2 million people. Because Russian people are very, very hardy and they're going to live in Alaska. Greenland stays the same, like the rest of the world. Same thing with Iceland. And the next place is Florida. 30 million people live in Florida. More people live in the north, which is around 21 million, and only 9 million people live in the south of Florida, where it's warmer, ironically. And that's because of the old East and West divide, because of the communist South Floridians. And also they did the same thing at China, the one-child policy. Buffer, Michigan has 2 million people, but Michigan has 2 million people. Meanwhile, Detroit has 6 million, and Chicago alone has 16 million people. Wisconsin has around 4 million. Dakota has around 3 million people. It is it's basically like Mongolia. Utah has 5 million people. They changed the name. California has 19 million people. The Cowboy Republic has around 5 million people. But as immigration from Texas continues, Texas has 53 million people. Despite having less people than Mexico, it is definitely far more developed. Kansas has around 6 million. The Great The Great Plains, the Great Plains Republic has around 4 million. Indiana has around 10 million. Ohio, 18 million. Arkansas, 3 million. Louisiana, 13 million. Alabama, 6 million. Tennessee, 9 million. Kentucky, 5 million. And of course, let's get to here. Georgia has around 21 million people. South Carolina, 17 million people. And North Carolina, around 31 million people. That's because birth rates have never really slowed down here. Virginia, 23 million people. Maryland, 7 million people. And Delaware, 1 million people. New Jersey has around 13 million people. Meanwhile, New York only has 13 million people because of the land taken. New England has a staggering 24 million people. And 16 million people in Pennsylvania. So besides Texas, the population is distributed individually. Most of the population centers out in the South is in the East Coast, like in modern day. Most of the central part of America is very unpopulated, and will likely stay unpopulated. Birth rates have also been declining, very quick. Have also started declining even in the poorer countries. Despite this, the Central North America has higher birth rates, including Texas. Southern countries also have higher birth rates as well, because southern countries also have more Christianity and more religious people living there. Meanwhile, the North is more atheist and more agnostic. There's many more things that could be talking about as well, excluding population. And also, we didn't really go in depth. There wasn't really many wars because it wasn't in a huge time period for wars. But it was still pretty interesting to do. Goodbye.